Welcome to One Chosen, where we use our scriptural foundation to discuss certain topics as being led by the Spirit. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to continue from part 1, as I found more information in regards to the monarchs of Britain. So as we do in every video, we're going to start off with some scriptural foundation. So this first verse comes from Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 7. It reads, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee." So what is he saying? The Most High is saying to remember the days of old, meaning remember history and the way it's taught. Because history tells a lot. It can make us improve as people by learning from the mistakes of others. But linking this to modern day, you get a lot of people out there who say things like, you prove that the monarchs of Britain are black, you've shown clear evidence of who they are and how they looked, but why does it matter? And who cares if they weren't white? Or, things like, it was a long time ago, forget about it. It's funny how these people love to say, they follow the Bible and that they're Christian, and they're all sprung on this concept about spreading love. But when you remember your history in the correct way, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter. I mean, they remember their days of old. They remember 9/11, Independence Day, Thanksgiving, or Poppy Day, where they do a 1-minute silence. They remember these days, but when you remember yours, all of a sudden, you get a pass. But yet these are people that believe in the Bible. So colour matters everywhere you go. If you're crossing the road and the red light turns green, colour matters. Why? Because the colour of the light tells the cars to stop and start, which can potentially save your life. Or if you're doing a chemistry test, when you're mixing some substances together to make a compound, the question paper might say, state the colour change, or what have you observed? You stating the right colour change can determine if you pass the test or not. Even in colour psychology, they know that colour matters. For instance, McDonald's uses certain colours for their logo, which are what? Red and yellow. Now, why would they use these colours? Because psychologists know that red and yellow stimulates hunger. These colours can potentially influence you in buying a burger from that store, which will in turn earn the company more money. So when you say colour doesn't matter, you're actually looking at the biggest walking contradiction there is. Because you know, through your own common sense, colour matters everywhere you go. So, the first person I want to go over is a man called Sir James Douglas. He was a renowned warrior during the time of Scotland's Battle of Independence against the British. This was around the time when William Wallace was around. If you watch movies like Braveheart, it's around the early 1300s. They actually depict Sir James Douglas in a movie called Outlaw King with Chris Pine. And he was called a specific nickname by his peers. His nickname was the Black Douglas. Now the question is, why was he called the Black Douglas? Well, if you look into it, they say that he was called the Black Douglas because of his dark deeds, or because he was a quote-unquote boogeyman to the Brits. But the question is, are these valid points? So let's start off with a bit of foundation and work from the ground up and see if this statement is correct or false. So the first source we're going to pull is from a book called The Story of King Robert the Bruce by Robert Led Mackey, and this is on page 243. It reads, "In one, by his great stature and breadth of shoulders, as well as by his dark complexion, we can easily recognize Sir James Douglas, though now his black hair is tinged grey." Now before we get into the reason why he was called the Black Douglas, we clearly see we have a big problem. We clearly see that Hollywood, in this movie called Outlaw King, doesn't depict Sir James Douglas as it's stated in the text. It said that he had a dark complexion. Does the actor portraying Sir James Douglas have a dark complexion? No. No, he does not. So somebody's lying. Hollywood is lying. Your TV is lying. So it said he had a dark complexion. Could this be the reason why he was called the Black Douglas? Now this next source we're going to pull is from a novel, and we know with novels they're actually fiction. But the reason why I want to pull this is because it helps reinforce the area of interest that we're discussing, because the author actually knew something, and you're going to clearly see that later on. So the book's called The King's Swift Rider, a novel on Robert the Bruce by Molly Hunter, and this is on pages 36 to 37. It reads, "I stared up at a man in front of me. He was young a slim man, middle in height, swarthy face, black-haired, black-browed, and the king had named him Douglas. So there he was in person now, the very man I had been told to find, the young hero whose colouring, not to mention his exploits against the English, had led him being known as the Black Douglas. So the author obviously knew something. It said that Sir James had a swarthy face. This reinforces the last quote we just read, where it said he had a dark complexion. Because we know by definition that swarthy means dark of complexion or black. So even though novels are actually fiction, some of them are actually based on real life events. So it said that the king named him Douglas. Now let's look up the word Douglas, because that name means something. So this next source is from a book called Family Names from the Irish Anglo-Saxon Anglo-Norman by Thomas Gentry, and this is on page 214. When you look up the word Douglas, it reads Du from dub, black, dark, glass, meaning green, grey, dark green, dark grey. So what I'm showing you is that the surname Douglas is actually referring to colours, and not just any colours, but dark colours, black, green or grey. So remember in part 1 when I showed that certain surnames throughout Britain and Scotland, and I showed that certain surnames actually denoted the complexion of the people in that region. I actually showed that some of these surnames actually mean black or swarthy. While this word Douglas actually means the same thing. It's actually denoting the complexion of the people in that region. So now that we know that the meaning of surnames are linked with complexion, and that Douglas is synonymous with black or dark colours, when the king called him the Black Douglas, he was basically saying, yes, you are dark, but this one is darker than dark, or blacker than black. Hence, it's the reason why he called him the Black Douglas. I hope that makes sense. So even though we pulled that statement from the novel, you got some people out there who's still going to say, this is no concrete evidence that proves the reason why it was called Black Douglas. Well, anyway, I preserved this statement for the last. So this is from a book called The Little Book of Scottish Clans by Alexander Fulton, and this is on page 16. It reads, the eldest son of William, Sir William Douglas, was the father of good Sir James, 1286 to 1330, who was the right-hand man of King Robert I, the Bruce, at the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314 and after it. He was called the Black Douglas from his complexion, a nickname which became attached to his line. So at the start of the video, we wanted to see the reason why he was called the Black Douglas, and we said that the reason why people call him the Black Douglas was because of his dark deeds and because he was a threat to the British Empire. And I'm not taking away the fact that this might have been correct, but it says in this statement the reason why he was called the Black Douglas was because of his complexion. I mean, this is something you're not going to get online. Online sources don't tell you this. They just tell you the same thing. Oh, he was a threat. You know, the British were scared of him. Yeah, we know that, but you're missing out one thing. His complexion. And that's the reason why he was called the Black Douglas. So start with the lies. You've been exposed. Sir Douglas on the left hand side is the same complexion as Robert the Bruce, but he's not brown. He's not of a dark complexion. So the Black Douglas, Sir James Douglas, was a so-called black man. It's just that simple. So this next topic we're going to pull is something really powerful, because this will help prove a lot about the black nobility in Britain. So for all you gainsayers out there who like to, come with your opinions, well, this fact is going to outweigh. So in Britain, around the late 1600s, early 1700s, there was a revolution known as the Jacobite Wars. So Jacobite is just a term used for supporters of the House of Stuarts. So remember when I talked about it in the first video, about the House of the Stuarts, going from King James I all the way down to King Charles II. These were just supporters of them people. So what the Jacobites were trying to do was to restore a man called King James II, which is King James I's grandson, back to the throne from a guy called King William III. During this time, there was a man called John Mackay, who was a Scot, and he was a government spy for King William III. His task was to gain intel and spy on King James II and his army. So essentially he was spying on his own people. And in this book, he details an account of the British Scottish nobles and leaders. And in it, he describes his observations of the people and how they looked. So let's go into the book and see what John Mackay saw. I want you to pay attention and also keep in mind that this was the same time when the so-called Negro was in slavery. So the first one we're going to examine is a guy called Charles Lennox. I'm going to read from the first paragraph. It says, Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, is the son of King Charles II. Now I'm going to go to the second paragraph and read right above the red line. It says, well-shaped, black complexion, much like King Charles. So it said Charles Lennox was black in complexion, just like King Charles. Remember in part 1 when I proved that King Charles II was a black man because he was nicknamed the Black Boy? Well, this is even more evidence that backs up that claim that King Charles was indeed a black man. But here proves from John Mackay's observation that his son, Charles Lennox, was also black because it said he had a black complexion. Question: so who is this guy on the left? When you search an image of Charles Lennox on Google, this is what shows. This ain't Charles Lennox as it describes in the text. Is this image true or is it false? Now anyone out there with the correct site will say this image is false. You want a bit more? Well, here's Charles, Duke of St. Albans. It says, is a son of King Charles II. So here's another son of King Charles II. Well, let's see how it's described. I'm going to go to the second paragraph. It says, he is of a black complexion, yet very much like King Charles. You see, this is why they gave the analogy about like father, like son. Because if you like your father, you like him in his characteristics and his looks. So let me ask the question again. Who is this guy on the right hand side? Because when you look up on Google, this image, this is what shows. This does not correlate with the text because it said he too had a black complexion. So this image is a lie. Alright, next. It says Charles Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, is the grandson to King Charles II. So it's not his son now, it's his grandson. So now we're looking at all the seed line of the Stuarts. So it says a tall black man about 25 years old. So it said he was a tall black man. Who is this guy on the left hand side? Can anyone explain to me when you look on Google why these images show up? This is not correlating to the text. So this image as well is a lie. Pay to mind that these people are all dukes, are all nobles, all knights. So these people are all leaders during the British Empire who are described as black. So let's look into a bit more and then we'll go on to the next topic. It says, John, Duke of Buckinghamshire, it says, was the Earl of Mulgrave in the reign of King Charles II. He is of a middling stature, of brown complexion. Just keeps going on and on. Now next it says, Charles, Duke of Somerset, it says in the red line, he is of middling stature, well-shaped, a very brown complexion. So ask yourselves, Negroes were in slavery during this time. Why weren't we taught in schools or taught on TV that Negroes on the other side of the world were ruling in their noble positions, ruling as kings and as dukes and earls and as knights? Not only that, but they went to a great depth from hiding this information from you by covering your faces with white ones. Now you see why they called it the Dark Ages. Now it's clear. It wasn't called the Dark Ages of Europe because it was a period of ignorance. It was called the Dark Ages of Europe because dark-skinned people were ruling. And you clearly see this from the evidence I'm bringing out. Why do you think they use the term the Black Plague? Because this was a disease that was going around infecting a major amount of black people in them regions. You see, they use these terms to your face, but they cover it up and make it seem like it's something else. Just like what you seen with the images, they cover up your faces and replace them with new ones. We'll use this guy for instance, Thomas Fairfax, who was an English nobleman and politician. Thomas Fairfax's nickname was called the Black Tom. But the funny thing is, when you look up this information on him, they will outright show you an image of his white face, but yet they will tell you that he was a black man. If you don't believe me, you can look this up on Wikipedia yourself and just type in Thomas Fairfax. But they get this quote from this book, Digressive Voices in Early Modern English Language by Anne Cotterhill, and it's on page 110. It says, coincidentally, Lord Fairfax was nicknamed Black Tom Fairfax for his dark hair and eyes and swarthy complexion, although certainly no gypsy. So you can look this information up even on Wikipedia. They'll say yes, he's of swarthy complexion, meaning he is a black man, but yet they'll show you on the right hand side an image of his white face. I mean, if you ask me, this is deception at its best, because if you didn't know what swarthy meant, you would have automatically thought that this guy was a white man, when that's not the fact. But let me go back, because I read something that might have flew over a lot of people's head. It said Lord Fairfax was nicknamed Black Tom for his dark hair, eyes and swarthy complexion, although certainly no gypsy. So hold on, what's this statement saying? This statement's saying that the gypsies as well had a swarthy complexion. So people like Tyson Fury that called himself the Gypsy King. So who were the real gypsies? What did they really look like? Well, this statement's saying that the real gypsies were of swarthy complexion. And just to ring a bell, if you watch a movie called The Hunchback of Notre Dame, it literally shows the gypsy Esmeralda with a swarthy dark complexion, which proves Disney must have known the truth behind that statement. So if the Black Tom was compared to a gypsy who was meant to have swarthy complexion, the Black Tom through this image looks nothing like Esmeralda. But the topic of the gypsies is something that we can discuss at a later stage. For now, we'll go into a bit more about the Black Tom. So this next one we're going to pull is from a book called A Life of the Great Lord Fairfax, Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Parliament of England by Clements Robert Markham. It's on page 18. It reads, Fairfax was tall and slight, with a dark complexion and brown hair. Alright, this is the last one now. It's from a book called Fairfax, A Life of Thomas Lord Fairfax by John Wilson. This is on page 14. Tom Fairfax, known from his dark looks as Black Tom. So now you know the reason why Thomas Fairfax was called the Black Tom, from his dark looks and his dark complexion. So therefore, Thomas Fairfax was a so-called black man. So the next person we're going to look at is a man called Edward of Woodstock, and he's the son of King Edward III. The most ironic thing about this man was that he was nicknamed something, and that nickname was Edward the Black Prince. Now the question is, why was he called the Black Prince? Scholars today have to say he was called the Black Prince because he wore black armor anytime he went into battle. And the truth is, he actually did wear black armor. But what puts it up for speculation was that scholars say he was possibly called the Black Prince because of the black armor. Didn't say he was called the Black Prince because of his armor. He said possibly. So you have to make that distinction. However, when you look into it, there is no actual concrete evidence to support this claim. I am convinced that he was called the Black Prince for another purpose. So without any further ado, let's get into it straight away. So this first quote is from a book called King Edward III by Michael St. John, and it's on page 49. It reads, Here at 10 in the morning of Friday the 15th of June 1330, Queen Philippa gave birth to their firstborn son, Edward of Woodstock, the future Black Prince. So it said he'd be called the future Black Prince. Now a lot of people may question that and say, why would it be called the Black Prince later on down the line? Because it said the future. But we will discuss this a little later on in the video. The main part of this verse that I wanted to pull was that it's born by a woman called Queen Philippa. So let's look up Queen Philippa and see how she looked. So before we pull the quote, I'd like to give it a background behind it. So at this time, there was a king called King Edward II who was ruling. And what he wanted to do was find a bride for his son, Edward, who would later become King Edward III. So we got a man called Bishop Stapleton and got him to look for a bride for his son. And when he was looking, he came across this woman called Philippa. And what he did was he actually recorded her physical appearance and how she looked on paper. So let's pick it up there. So this quote comes from a book called The Plantagenets, 1154 to 1485 by John Harvey. And it's on page 134. So remember, this is what Bishop Stapleton recorded. It says, "The lady whom we saw has not uncomely hair, betwixt blue, black, and brown. Her nose is fairly smooth and even, save that it is somewhat broad at the tip and somewhat flattened, yet it is no snub nose. Her nostrils are also broad. Her mouth is fairly wide. Her lips somewhat full, and especially her lower lip. Moreover, she is brown of skin all over, and much like her father, and in all things she is pleasant enough as it seems to us." So picture in your mind, who looks like that today? Who has that phenotype of not only brown skin all over, but a wide nose and full lips? For those who are watching who are a mature audience would state that's the phenotype of the so-called black woman. I stated at the start of this topic that I'm convinced the reason why Edward of Woodstock was called the Black Prince, because evidence points to his mom being a so-called black woman. What I'm about to show you now is going to prove everything was bringing out. This is a medieval carving of Queen Philippa found at the St. Catherine Chapel in limestone. Now let's see how this medieval carver depicted her. So as you can see, Queen Philippa had a broad nose and thick lips, corresponding well with the text. Not only that, but the carver actually depicted her brown skin, just like the wood he was carving. Clearly an image of a so-called black woman. But this information doesn't end here. There's a bit more to it. Remember when I said earlier that a man called King Edward married Queen Philippa? Well, this image you're about to look at is of King Edward III, which is Edward of Woodstock's dad. Now, why would the sculptor depict him in this way? This image shows he's got a broad nose. Not only that, but the carver decided to leave him in the brown complexion, the same as the wood. He didn't even bother painting white. He left him in that tone for a reason. Now here's another image of King Edward III. You can clearly see this is a black man. There ain't no doubt about it. I mean, he looks a lot like Frederick Douglass, you know, with that woolly hair. Or possibly someone like Morgan Freeman, you know, with that copper skin tone. Now if you dig up a bit of history about King Edward, he actually started this fraternity called the Knights of the Garter. And in this image, you see him in this sort of cloak, which is the Knights of the Garter gown. I mean, you see them today, you know, with smiles on their face, parading around with the Knights of the Garter cloaks. Wow, you can do that, but you're found as black. Or should I say, so-called black. Now here's another image of King Edward III, which shows his swarthy complexion. He was clearly a black man, and I know some may not agree to that, but this is what the facts show. Now let's go back to the statement which we showed, where it said Edward of Woodstock will be called the future Black Prince. So I stated I was going to go back to this and explain why I believe he was called the future Black Prince. Well, to answer this question, we'll look into this book called The Negro Rulers of Scotland and the British Isles by Dr. John Johnson. This on page 58, it reads, Edward was called the Black Prince because of his black skin and his obsession with black armour The French called him La Noir, the Niger, when he was a child. So you're wondering why he was called the future Black Prince? Because later on in the future, when he became a child, the French called him the Niger, or La Noir, or the Black Prince, because of his black complexion. Now this proves that Edward of Woodstock was called this name because of his skin tone, not his armor. Now this makes a lot of sense with the imagery and the text we've been showing his dad, King Edward III, as a black man, and his mom, Queen Philippa, as a black woman. So what we learned today, what we discovered from all this information, we found that history, or should I say his story, likes to depict things in their way, for the benefit of themselves and not for the benefit of the truth. We found the reason why certain nobles were called things like the Black Boy, the Black Prince, the Black Douglas, or the Black Tom. They weren't called these names for things like, their armor. They was called these names because of their complexion. All in all, what you've discovered is history taught by the oppressors is going to keep you in chains. History taught by the victors will feed you lies. So let's teach history correctly for the benefit of the truth and for the benefit of the next generation.